Thank you, and thank you all for joining at Mason today, and thank you very much to Kevin for partnering. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our projects with city and county governments, and then see how that might apply to the open source world. First, with a little bit of background, though. Two issues or two trends that are really having an impact on the world. One is digitization. And an example of that, I think, is Estonia, who's pretty much had a digital government for the last 10 years. So Estonia has only had its independence 3 or so years over the last 700 until 1991. And they decided to compete as an innovator in technology. And they had a lot of computer science history from the Soviet Union times. And Microsoft adopted them as a test bed. And so Estonia being quite a model now for digitization. And another example, which is really quite current, is India. So India has provided digital identity to over 1 billion people in the last 5 years, using iris scan and fingerprints, and now moving towards facial recognition. So the idea of it is 80% of India's population lives in rural areas. This is about 1 billion people, and this is a way to empower them, but also to address corruption. Another big trend relevant to cities is urbanization. Only recently, over 50% of the world's population started to live in cities. Used to be more predominantly rural. And over the next 50 years, it's projected to be 70% of the world's population living in cities. Many of these are going to be mega cities, 10 to 20 million people, many of those in developing countries. Lagos only had 500,000 people 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, and now it has over 20 million. Many of the cities, including in the US and even in the smaller towns, are interested in digital services. So whether in rural Virginia or across the country, the citizens and residents are interested in being able to access services online, but oftentimes they don't have the IT expertise or the budgets to do it in a cost-effective or in a secure manner. One other background slide. This is actually kind of fascinating, is the trends in technology. On the upper left is computer storage. And does anyone know when the first 1 gigabyte computer storage was commercially available, or project a guess? It was IBM offered it. It was 1980, and it cost $40,000, was the size of a refrigerator, 550 pounds, and this big. So today you can go to Micro Center or a computer store where you live and get 3 or 4 terabytes for $50. Similarly, on the fiber optic network, the first transatlantic cable was only in the late 1950s, less than 100 simultaneous calls, now 3, 4, 5, 6 million. And on processing, coincidentally, the lunar lander from NASA and the first Apple computer, they both had processors about 2,000 cycles a second, now 6 or 7 or 8 billion. So just as today we couldn't, just as 20 years ago we couldn't have projected where we would be today with technology and with applications, similarly it's impossible to project where we'll be in 20 or 30 years because these trends are continuing. Here's an interesting chart from ITU. They put out a Measuring the Information Society chart every year, report. The blue line up at the top, that's increased quite a lot, 107 mobile phone subscriptions per 100 people worldwide this last year. So some countries have over 100 per 100. Some of the Scandinavian countries, more than 1 phone per person. But on average worldwide, 107 per 100. It includes developing countries and developed. This one is even steeper, mobile broadband. All the way up to 70 mobile broadband subscriptions per 100 people worldwide. And you can project that up to almost everyone in a number of years. So it's leading to a lot of changes in services and access here in the United States, but around the world. 5G, of course. And the challenge then for cities and counties and governments and organizations is it's not just the technology, but it's also the underlying policy and policy framework and governance. And so this is a World Economic Forum slide. This is the policy and governments, leadership capability, and this is technology. And you can see some countries are really top-notch in technology, so India, for example, but not quite as good in policy and governance. And others have quite established governance structures. Kazakhstan, for example, perhaps not as good in technology. And then some countries are very good at both, the countries that do the best. So that's true for a company, an organization, a city, or a county government, but also for a national government. It takes both. So what are some of the cities doing? Many of the talks today have talked about open data and big data. New York City has a wonderful open data project, and they get the data both from the data sets that they generate, but also through their 311 system. So a fantastic system, one access point for the city, many cities have this, to call, and you're put in touch with any of the government agencies. Kind of a scandal a number of years ago, New Orleans implemented a system like this, and the residents and citizens in New Orleans couldn't figure out why there was no impact. They would call in and nothing would ever happen. They would call with a complaint or a request. The city didn't connect the 311 center to the city agencies, and so it ended up being an expose on one of the local news stations. The mayor at the time was the mayor from the Hurricane Katrina, who's now in prison for a different reason. So they sunsetted the project and restarted it. But this project, they now have 10 years of data, making it available to the public, and you can see over time different types of calls that they have early evening and early morning and all throughout the evening. So really a fantastic system as to what cities can do and what's possible. And then more and more obviously with blockchain. So our project, it's a National Science Foundation project, and the motivation of it is that many of these cities and counties and local governments are more and more offering digital services, and that many of these local governments also have critical infrastructure, whether it be electric or water, wastewater, transport systems, smart metering. Many even have airports, but they don't have the budget or the cybersecurity capability to provide these in a secure manner. So there's somewhat of a conflict that they are and would like to provide these services, but they don't have the expertise and the budget to do it securely, especially as more and more things are becoming connected to networks. And I think this is where there's a potential application for open source. So we have many partners, including a lot of the local governments in Virginia, the state government in Virginia and in West Virginia. Also, Palo Alto Networks has been very supportive. And so the two objectives of the project, one is to work with them to foster collaborations amongst local governments. So it could be a group of smaller local governments that for example, we're working with a group in Northern Neck and Middle Peninsula. It can be a very large local government with smaller ones, for example, a Loudoun County with the town governments locally, or it could be a group of mid-sized ones. And then the second aspect of it is to work with them to overcome some of the institutional barriers against partnering and identify areas where they would really benefit from partnering. This is a map of a couple years old of the US. The lighter colors are quite low population levels. So you can see most of the country, most of the counties in the countries have quite low population densities and very low populations, and correspondingly quite low budgets for in general and for IT, but are offering more and more citizen services and have critical infrastructure. Here's some from Virginia. This is an airport out in Manassas, electric company in Radford. Many of the local governments in Virginia have their own water supply and water organizations or companies. About 60%, a very high percentage of the roads in the U.S. are locally managed or operated. There's over 50,000 water companies in the U.S., most owned by local government. So very, very large risk with limited budget and expertise. This is the Atlanta case, obviously, with the ransomware. Sorry. It's a cover report, which we'll come back to. And these are some of the areas that the local governments have identified where they could really benefit from partnering. One is on governance, so sharing of strategies and sharing of policies for local government, for acceptable use for mobile, how to work with vendors, how to work with contractors. Another is incident response plans. Many of the local governments do not have these. Others is joint third-party contracting, what the cybersecurity review should be. So here at Mason, we have an architecture review board that does that. Some of the local governments are trying to put that sort of thing in place. On the technology procurement side, a great interest in shared procurement, local governments partnering together. Some of the services from the cybersecurity companies are quite expensive or out of reach of smaller local governments or mid-sized ones, but by partnering together they can afford it. Or one or two of the states are now offering ability to purchase these types of services through the state. Here in Virginia, you're able to purchase technology services through VITA, but historically the Virginia Information Technology Group, that was through Northrop Grumman for the last 10 or so years. But historically, the cities and counties haven't found the prices that much better than what they can get on the open market. But perhaps with the new arrangement, it would be a little bit different. Joint staffing, a lot of interest in this idea of sharing a CISO. So Durham County and Durham City in North Carolina, last couple of years, they both can't afford a CISO, looking into jointly having one together. But other counties and cities looking to perhaps share a tenth of one each as a way of accessing it. Also, many of the local governments are single-threaded on technology expertise, on a specific technology, oftentimes with someone who's reaching retirement age. So looking to be able to share and partner, especially on the hard-to-get or very rare technology expertise that many of you all have. And then on communications, it's very interesting that the state governments have different roles in regard to local government cybersecurity, and are organized differently. So here, our CISO in Virginia is very inward-facing on state government agency systems and services. The interactions with the local governments is through the Homeland Security Office, but still quite arm's length. In West Virginia, the CISO and the Chief Technology Officer actually has a much more affirmative role with the local governments. And there's also a vast difference in the role of the Public Service Commission. So in Connecticut, the Public Service Commission has an active role in working with utilities on cybersecurity. In Mississippi, the Public Service Commission considers part of its role economic development, and so they're working with the local governments and the utilities on broadband. Here, ours doesn't take that much of a role in cybersecurity, except for the rate base and the investment. So a lot of potential and a lot of interest in ways to fund. We have a mechanism in Virginia for funding schools and school tech. We don't have a corresponding mechanism for local government yet with cybersecurity. Here's one of the initiatives that we've undertaken. Arlington County volunteered their technology policies to the project, and working with Arlington County, we made them more generic and have shared them out, and some of the local governments are working to adopt those for their own circumstance. And here's some of the workshops we've had, a statewide one in Virginia, working with three regions of Virginia, Northern Neck, Middle Peninsula, then the Loudoun region with the towns, most of all who have water supplies, and then the Roanoke region. And then a statewide workshop in West Virginia coming up, partnering with the Chief Technology Officer. There's a lot of interest amongst the local governments because of their need, that they recognize the risk, many of them. Some of them aren't able to communicate the risk that effectively to their city and town councils or county governments, but more and more recognizing it. Okay. What are some of the governments then doing with open source, and what are some of the challenges? So we mentioned how the local governments have limited expertise and capability and budgets, especially the small and medium-sized one. So I think with that, it has made open source look a little bit unattainable for them. I think in some cases, even cybersecurity, a little bit unattainable. But as they partner and recognize more and more the need, I think more and more will start to look to the open source community for building up their capability and expertise. Are you all familiar with 18F? the history of 18F. So really interesting organization. Back when the Obama administration came into office, they wanted to build some of the speed of Silicon Valley into US government IT, and they established this group called 18F, and it's named after the building. GSA is on 18F Street downtown. And they created a office environment kind of like a Silicon Valley company like Modular, that they worked with the government to adjust contracting so that someone could come in and work there for 6 months to a year. And so then they assist and work on agency projects. UK has a similar type program, so does North Carolina. So their approach is all open source, and I think they've been in the vanguard of the US government of open source. So they open source for everything, and also trying to make available everything they do back to the open source community. Their rationale is agility, being able to experiment quickly. It's building a community, as you've all talked about today, and through that, conceptually, greater security. They have a view that it's lower cost and also an interest in shareability and reusability. So really, I think in the vanguard of open source for government. US CIO Council's approach is somewhat different and earlier. So Tony Scott was Chief Information Officer in the last administration. He was also CIO at Disney and General Motors for many years. US government's approach is when there's going to be custom software, custom developed software, encouraging the agencies to look to open source, especially for reusability, and then they're running a pilot project that 20% of the code over a 3-year period should be contributed back to the open source community. So not quite yet the 18F vision, but somewhat on the path. Now city and county government, a little bit not where these are. DC government has a pilot program through the GitHub platform. Again, mainly a pilot for experimenting with open source, trying to build a community. Bloomington, Indiana, also more active past the pilot stage, but again, quite limited number of applications. And then Chicago, really quite a robust project, but again, policy not that developed. Many projects that are contributing to the community, community adopting some of them, trying to be open source, but not documenting or defining a policy to the extent that an 18F might, or as many of the companies that you've talked about this morning might. So I think open source is a tremendous opportunity for local government. At the same time, too, for the smaller governments, there's the challenge of how they can partner together with a bigger government, such as Fairfax County, that has the expertise and the budget and the IT staff to really make open source work for them. So thank you again for all joining here at Mason, and thanks to Apache, too. Anyone have any thoughts or questions? Yes?
So what can we do as open source providers to speed this process up?
Some of the communities of local governments, I think they would love to partner with you all or with Apache or some group on some of the initiatives that they're looking to undertake. They have real needs, both in SIMs. Vast majority of local governments don't have SIMs or monitoring capability real time. The smaller ones that do reviews, they rely some on the Department of Homeland Security reviews, which are fantastic and at no cost, but they're snapshots. So any type of tools or capability that you all are working on would be fantastic. They're all, or many of the smaller and mid-sized ones, with the water companies and electric and more of the smart transportation have great needs too. So if there was a way to structure engagements or partnerships or pilots that would scale, I think that they'd really benefit. I think you all would find the work interesting too. And really worthwhile, as many of the speakers have talked about why you've joined Apache or work with Apache. Any other? Yes?
I mean, are local governments more open to open source than they were? Because I thought there was sort of always the, where do I get support, and that sort of, I want to pay a vendor mentality seems very strong in the local government.
In some, I think it's a very good point. There's, for many of them, that they aren't able to scale to the size to work with the very large cyber vendors, like Symantec or Palo Alto are really quite costly for in general, but I think fantastic products, but for many local governments. And more that the state governments are looking to provide services back to the local, and some of the state governments are quite amenable or interested in open source. West Virginia, for example, is quite interested in experimentation. They had that pilot in the fall with a blockchain voting for one region. So I think it depends on the government, but there's this skills and budget gap, and so whichever way they can bridge it, I think more and more are looking to do. Okay. With that, well, thank you all again for coming.